right, the hearing before the Oversight Investigation Subcommittee will now come to order, and we thank the witnesses for their indulgence, and the chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement. Nearly 80 years ago, Aldous Huxley wrote his literary masterpiece, Brave New World. In that book, he posited a future where genetic engineering is commonplace and human beings, aided by cloning, are mass-produced. Controllers and predestinators replaced mothers and fathers, the words themselves considered smut. As the new authors of Human Life, in an uncompromising search for human happiness and stability, the possibility of human individuality has been entirely jettisoned. For most of its 80 years, Brave New World could be seen as a disturbing work of science fiction. But that is no longer the case. The possible cloning of human beings is now relegated to the world of, not relegated to the world of fiction, and the question we must now ask is this: what should we do with this science? That is what brings us here today. Recently, however, two groups of scientists have announced their intention to manufacture the first human clone. One group, the Raelianos, a Canadian-based religious cult, announced late last year that it had found an American couple willing to pay $500,000 to clone their deceased child. The Raelianos claim to be conducting experiments in a laboratory in the United States. Several publications, including Wired magazine and the New York Times, have published in-depth stories which take the Raelianos' announcement quite seriously. The other group, an international consortium of scientists led by Dr. Pavlos Zavos, a reproduction researcher, and his partner Severino Antinori, an Italian fertility doctor, have stated their intent to develop clones for infertile couples. In January of this year, Dr. Zavos' group announced that within 2 years, it intends to clone the first human being at a site outside the United States. The technique used to clone other mammals has proved difficult and dangerous. Before scientists successfully produced Dolly, there were 276 failures. Last week, my staff and I met with Dr. Simon Best, a member of the Dolly research team. Extrapolating from its results, he told us that data suggests that it might take 1,000 surrogate mothers to successfully clone a human being, at the cost of 999 miscarriages, stillbirths, and infants born with serious and unpredictable birth defects. The rate of failure in animal cloning should serve as a fire bell in the night. Behind the headlines of apparent success in animal cloning lies a failure rate as high as 95 to 97%. Would human cloning lessen the worth of individuals and diminish respect for human life by turning procreation into a manufacturing process? Is there a bright line between the joining of a man and a woman's reproductive cells and the replication of just one person's genetic material? Is the one creation and the other mere construction? We also, in fairness, need to listen to the arguments in favor of human cloning. There are those who argue that reproductive freedom includes human cloning, perhaps as a means to address the problem of male infertility. Others advocate cloning as a means to replicate a deceased loved one. For yet others, human cloning is justified because it may provide important advances in scientific knowledge. You will also hear from controversial witnesses. We hope to learn from their testimony whether the projects they envision are credible scientifically.
Thank you for this invitation. I represent Clonación, as you know, and this is a private company based in the United States that sets its goal to produce the first human clone. I'd like to remind you that when we talk about the first human clone, we are talking about a baby. We are talking about parents who would like to be cloned to have this baby, and I will address that issue after. But first of all, you talk about harms, and I heard a lot about the defects, and that this has been on the press for weeks now. First of all, if you look at the publication regarding cattle cloning in the year of 2000, if you look at the numbers that were published there, they have a success rate, an average success rate between 15 and 20%. The usual success rate in vitro fertilization clinics, the best one, are between 30 and 40%, meaning that today, 15 to 20% of implantation of calves, of embryo for cattle cloning are bringing perfectly healthy clone. This is very comparable to the success rate of in vitro fertilization in human.
There's a basic difference between IVF, in vitro fertilization, and cloning. In vitro fertilization, the sperm and the egg have gone through the reprogramming. There's no problem with that. So to compare now in vitro fertilization rates to be high or low with cloning lower high, that means comparing apple with eggs or apple with oranges. It has no usefulness in this comparison. And then finally, 15 to 20% success rate in cloning of cattle. I just wonder where these data come from, and I think my neighbor can really address this. I think this is very obscure sources probably. And of course, 15 to 20% success. What do they call success? Abnormal cattle? They don't know whether they're abnormal. As I said before, I don't believe there's a single normal clone in existence. All clones have some subtle defects. If the defects are serious, they die early in development. If they're less serious, they go to birth and die at birth. And the ones which have less serious ones go later and die after a week or two. And then Dolly made it to adulthood. But Dolly is not normal. Dolly is overweight. Ian Wilmut doesn't know why it's overweight. And Dolly may have other problems which are beyond our ability to analyze in an animal. We cannot analyze in animals easily what the brain function is. We only can do this in humans, unfortunately, when they socialize and go to school. But then we have an abnormal person. So I think it's totally irresponsible and totally misleading to use scientific data, which are plenty there, and select certain data to make a statement which is false.
Are you familiar with a magazine called Wired Magazine?
Yes.
All right. I'm going to read from page 133. It says, from Montreal, it takes about an hour by highway and country roads to reach a huge white barn painted with the word UFO land. This is a home base for the Raelianos, Clonad's founders and religious believers who teach that advanced extraterrestrial beings called Elohim landed in France in 1973 to meet aspiring race car driver Claude Vorilhon. They changed Vorilhon's name to Rael and told him that humans are clones of Elohim and revealed that someday he will lead mankind into a blissful techno-utopian future. Rael was to be the last prophet, the end of the line that includes Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, and Buddha. Are those accurate comments? And are those accurate comments?
Well, that's the comments of that Brian Alexander. And I mean, there is a religion that is called the Raelian religion, and you have Rael here in this room, and I
Rael is in this room?
Yes, and I understand that he's a witness, so he will explain all of this to you.
I wish to dedicate my testimony to Giordano Bruno, who was burned alive 4 centuries ago, sentenced to the death penalty by the Catholic Church for saying that there was life on other planets. If 100 years ago the religious power could have passed law against the freedom of science, we today would have no antibiotic, no surgery, no blood transfusion, no organ transplant, no vaccine, no cars, no electricity, no computers, and no airplane. Stopping science is a crime against humanity. If disease discoveries were forbidden 100 years ago, 3 billion people would never have enjoyed life, dying at very early stage of their existence, and they may have included your own parents and yourself. We can say that at least 90% of the people in this room are still alive today thanks to science. 3 billion people. This is more than any other criminal against humanity ever killed, including Hitler or Napoleon. Today you have in your hands the life of billions of people alive now or future generations. You have the choice to be remembered as heroes for saving billions of lives, or as criminals against humanity for denying them a possible cure or a new life, or even eternal life by retarding scientific progress. Retarding only because it will be done anyway, somewhere, someday, as, thankfully, nothing can stop science. But law can slow down research, and it is the people who will suffer from it. And you will be responsible for the delay and the death and the suffering it will create. These deaths and suffering can be years as well, as lawmakers are not immune to sudden disease, or those of your beloved own children or beloved grandchildren. Religious people who are against human cloning should be free to refuse it for themselves or their own children, as they are free today to refuse abortion, blood transfusion, or surgery. Human cloning will make it possible for us to reach eternal life. It is the right of the people who want to enjoy the fruit of scientific progress, including human cloning and eternal life, to benefit from it. If religion and superstition, which are the same, had power over science, we would still be living in the dark age. Your great constitution includes the freedom of religion, and that means also the freedom to be atheist, freedom to believe that there is no God and benefit from science without any moral restriction. We Raelians believe that science should be our religion, as science saves lives while religion and superstition kill. Science destroys superstition and supernatural belief. That's why religion was always an enemy of science and progress, and is again trying to stop science at its best. It should be the freedom of the people to decide if they want to benefit or not from human cloning. Legalizing human cloning is protecting the right of the unreborn, as cloning makes it possible a second chance to live for infants, like the one cloned planned to clone now, a 10-month-old baby killed by medical malpractice. It could be your own beloved child or grandchild. Think about him personally. Lawmakers should not be accomplices of dark age power and superstition, as they will be judged by history. Human cloning is the first step toward another great discovery, the creation of totally artificial form of life, like that was done by our creators, the Elohim, when they did created us on earth. Not only human cloning is not against the wish of what people call God, but it is our Creator's plan to have us discover and use it, as many other religious leaders claim, becoming, as it is written in the Bible, equal to our Creators.
One of the real issues that bothers me about this also is the concept of the difference between resurrection and reproduction. This is not resurrection. It is not resurrection. Okay, it's a reproductive technology, and whether or not you want to say, you know, whatever side you take on it should take, it's simply another form of assisted reproductive technology, and we can talk about the ethical issues aside as to whether we should be doing it. But you still wouldn't do that if 90% of the babies died, if it put the surrogate mothers in risk, and if you had these potentials for developmental problems to begin with. There's a real ethical issue, I think, and a real danger that this can be thought of as resurrection when it absolutely is not. And in fact, a clone wouldn't even be as similar as an identical twin because it would have a new mitochondrial genotype.
If Columbus, for instance, would just even think that the winds are too troublesome, or Mr. Neil Armstrong will think for a moment that he may not be climbing up the ladder back onto his shuttle to get back to the world, back to this earthly world, I should say, he would probably never take that bold step to get there and come back. So those are possibilities. Now, as a scientist, I have to ask my people, my scientific colleagues on the right here, as to have they ever cloned a human clone embryo, and have they ever been able to study that? I want to ask them that question, because I think that if you've never been to the moon, you can't talk about the life and the environment on the moon. That's why we went there, we found out, and came back, and we said all about it, and we have written books about it.
One, if I would like to know from Dr. Zavos whether he has cloned a human, what his experience is. So I would like to know that. But let me say clearly that humans are not guinea pigs. So if you do experiments with humans, it's application. But it's not experimentation to find out science. I think that you do in animals, and it's clear in animals. This has not been resolved, and therefore it's just out of the question, to my opinion, and it's totally irresponsible to even attempt to consider doing these experiments with cloning.
Neil Armstrong's name was evoked. Neil Armstrong was an exhaustively trained adult volunteer. I wish he were here to give his own opinion about the use of his name in this cause. In the astonishingly arrogant claims, I believe, made in his name, and to ask him whether he would have agreed to make his voyage, however historically important, over the damaged bodies of women and the broken bodies of children. The probably illusory control people believe it may offer over the traits of their offspring. I've fantasized that the best antidote to the enthusiastic support of cloning that exists out there, at least among some people, would be if somebody actually did clone Michael Jordan. And Michael, too, was totally uninterested in basketball and really wanted to be a good accountant. What makes Michael Jordan great is his genes, but so much more than that. It is his drive, his fierce determination, his unexcelled competitiveness, not even just his physical gifts.
How, in your assessment, as a lay person, not as a scientist, but obviously someone very involved in this, when, if the federal government doesn't get involved, when will the first human clone be born?
It will happen anyway, as nothing can stop science.
No, but I mean, I guess I don't want to pin you down too much, but two things. One is it safe to do it now? Now. And number two is, when will it happen?
When, as another scientist explained earlier, when IVF started, there was only 2% of success.
Right.
How did they improve to reach almost 100% today? By doing it. If they stop doing it, science has to do it to progress. The first heart transplant were deadly. The first airplane were deadly. But we didn't stop it because of that, because by doing it, scientists can improve their technology and finally be successful.
I don't feel you answered it, but that's okay. Let me just respond, because I think it's worthy of response. Specifically, with in vitro fertilization, when it wasn't successful, you didn't create a live birth or a miscarriage that is tragic consequences. And I think the problem that we have here is the lack of success in each in vitro situation. The downside risk was minimal. The downside risk of the unsuccessful cloning process, based on everything we've seen at this point, is dramatic. I mean, very, very serious. For the person involved, for the mother involved, for the child involved, for society as a whole. So I think the comparison is a totally unfair comparison.
I answer?
What is accomplished, I find myself asking today, by proclamations such as those made by Dr. Richard Seed, Dr. Zavos, and the Raelians? Well, it seems to me that two things are clearly accomplished. Number one, you get enormous heaps of free publicity. This is good for business, if that's what you're after. Number two, you provide false hope and possible exploitation of parents desperate in their grief over having lost a child. One more thing, if people are permitted to go ahead at this time, is that we will have many dead fetuses, probably some damaged women, and maybe, but maybe not, a live-born child or two who will almost certainly be born with severe abnormalities.
And I simply want to make sure we don't leave our discussion without underlining that the fundamental moral question here is not the safety question. That is a fundamental moral question of itself. But back of that lies the question of cloning in itself. And I made some reference to the European Convention on Biomedicine and Human Rights, which is the one international treaty on bioethics, which has been added a protocol to ban cloning. And I just want to read the two lines in the convention which specifically give the fundamental ground for this ban on cloning. There's a reference to psychological, social, medical problems which may be expected. But the basic phrase is this one: because of the instrumentalization of human beings through the deliberate creation of genetically identical human beings is contrary to human dignity, and thus constitutes a misuse of biology and medicine. That at heart this discussion is not about the safety issues. That is one reason why some of us think the FDA approach is not adequate, By the same token, it's why the moratorium approach is not adequate. But the question at heart here is whether ever human beings, even if it's perfectly safe, should be created as photocopies of other human beings. And whereas we've had various people say that they would quite like to be cloned, I think we've yet to have somebody say they wish they had been born a clone. And that the bottom line for me in this issue is that every child has a right not to have been born a clone, because it's the instrumentalization of the child which is the central moral question at stake. Thank you.
This issue is probably the most complex and profound issue that this Congress will wrestle with in this new millennium. These are uncharted waters. And the question for us, I think, is difficult because we don't know what lies beneath these waters. And what makes it even more agonizing is that we're asked to place not ourselves or not the witnesses on these waters, but little babies to float out on these very uncharted waters. It is my view that risk is so grave, and it appears to be that grave for the foreseeable future, for decades, that we will have to act. And I suspect that, in fact, I'm certain that in the near future, Chairman Tozan, the chairman of this committee, myself, and Mr. Deutsch, the ranking member, will introduce legislation to ban the cloning of a human being in this country. And perhaps we'll have you back testify about that legislation at some point in the future. Thank you again, and this hearing is adjourned.